Hello everyone, welcome back to the Sandbag TCG channel. Today we're actually not going to be talking about specifically Sandbag TCG, but instead just trading card games in general. And yeah, this is going to be a fun video. I'm going to be explaining why meta decks are not necessarily good decks. So, let's get to it. One thing that's going to be very important in this video is how am I defining good? So, the way that I would describe a so-called good deck is, let's take this scenario, right? You are playing against a friend. You're trying to see whether your deck is a good deck, and regardless of what trading card game you're playing. So you are playing your deck against your friend, and you pull it out for the first time and you play against them. One thing that would define whether your deck is good is what are the odds of you winning that game that you're playing against them when you pull out your deck for the first time, and assuming that you already know the deck pretty well, and you play against them. Now, another thing though that's really important is as you continue to play with your deck, how often do you win with your deck? I'm so into this game, so I've played like 50 games with this one deck that I really like, and I've won like 30 of those games. That's a pretty good deck. You're winning the majority of your games. If you had won like all 50 games, you're like undefeated with that deck over this extended period of time, and that's a really good deck. And definitely it also depends on what how skilled your opponents are and what decks they're playing, but we're going to assume that your friends are good players with solid decks. So let's take a look at why meta decks might not actually be that good. And one thing that's really important is not all meta decks aren't good. There are actually some meta decks that are legitimately good, but oftentimes they're not necessarily good. So let's take a look. The first big thing to note is tournaments are not the same as casual play. And generally the majority of games that people are playing are casual. Truth is that tournaments are not completely indicative of how good a deck is, although tournaments are indicative of how meta a deck is. Second reason is that decks can be countered. And so we'll get back to this a little bit later, but imagine that you are playing the most meta deck and it has a pretty significant weakness. Chances are that you are going to run into people who are going to counter your deck more often than if you have this really not meta deck with some weakness. Nobody's going to go out of their way to counter your not meta deck, but people will go out of their way to counter your meta deck. And so in casual play, that can actually make meta decks a little bit worse. Third reason is high roll. And this actually connects back to tournaments being different from casual play, but meta decks are often more about how consistently good the deck is, rather than kind of how good the deck can be. And so, depending on the situation, a more consistent deck or a more high rolly deck could be better or worse. And the fourth reason is because of rogue decks. Regardless of what trading card game you're playing, please stick around. I am going to be going into some examples that are more from Cardfight Vanguard, but I will be explaining them substantially, so really stay tuned. This applies to basically any trading card game. So here we are on VG Paradox. This is the website for Vanguard tops. You can see that in this most recent set for the English format, this deck Shiranui is number one. It is topped. It is Aside from Luard, it is ahead of everything third place and below by quite a significant margin with 68 tops versus Varga here's 26 tops. So this deck is really meta. And if we take a look at Luard, this deck is also really meta. But if we take a look at a nice little previous format here, the Lyrical Set 4 format, Shiranui was meta back then as well by a significant margin at 36 tops. But let's take a look at this second place deck, Prism, with 19 total tops. Now, I'm just going to tell you something about Prism. For those of you who don't know, this deck hard counters Shiranui. I was playing against somebody who plays Prism at my locals, and they were saying they've almost never lost to Shiranui with Prism. And the reason for that is basically Shiranui's entire gimmick is like, you can take your cards and attack you with them. Prism can put all of its cards back into its hand at the end of its turn. For those of you who are like, wait, it returns stuff to hand? That's overpowered. It's a little bit less overpowered in Vanguard, but still really strong, and still basically hard counters Shiranui. It can shut down a lot of Shiranui's main gimmicks by basically playing exactly the way it normally wants to play anyway. And so you have this deck in second place. But think about this. Prism would therefore be a meta deck, right? Well, Prism, I will say, is a pretty solid deck, but it is not nearly as amazing as rank 2 might sound like it is. It just counters Shiranui. And in casual play, if we're thinking, oh, you have an equal chance of running into whatever deck, and, we're just thinking about how good a deck is, not necessarily relative to the current format, right? Prism is good because Shiranui is meta, not because it's such a good deck. It is a good deck, but it's not crazy better than a lot of these decks. I'll just tell you that as a Vanguard player. Yeah, and so Shiranui as well, if you're playing Shiranui casually, then after a little bit, probably everybody would just start playing Prism against you, and you would never win. So Shiranui isn't even necessarily that amazing of a deck. And there are a lot of other decks that counter Shiranui, actually, which is really funny. Let's see, I'm just going to scroll down and see if I can find something. Greedon can sometimes counter Shiranui. Mushiking, I was playing in a major tournament. This deck is basically just the anti-everything meta, and it's, in my opinion, a pretty good deck. But it counters literally everything meta. I don't even know why it doesn't top more, but that actually brings me to one of my next points, which is popularity. Right. Mushiking is a very unpopular deck. That doesn't mean it's not good. If more people played Mushiking, it would top more. And so that's a way that tournaments are different from casual play. What tops is all going to be based on what people are playing, and the meta is going to be kind of self-defining. What's meta is going to be based on what's meta, and that's not necessarily going to mean that those decks are really that amazing or that good. In tournaments, you play like 9 rounds or something, and you don't run into any like random decks usually. People don't want to bring like a random deck to a tournament. So instead, you have to be able to play a deck that will win a lot of times against the meta decks. Now, let me see if I can find like a high roll deck here. A deck that is, it takes a fair amount of luck, but then it really wins. It can kind of glitch sometimes. Minerva. This deck is basically a very piece reliant, combo oriented deck. Now, combo oriented decks might not end up in the meta as much. If you're a Magic player, you know this. A lot of decks that have some crazy combo that makes them go infinite and like wins you the game aren't actually meta, even though they're really good, because, well, the meta can counter them and they're not that consistent. You could have an infinite combo that makes your deck so good that makes your deck win 7 out of 9 times, but you have to win 8 out of 9 times, right? And so if you're playing a deck that, is really consistent and does well 9 out of 9 times, it can win and top a tournament. But if you're playing a deck that wins 7 out of 9 times, you won't be able to top a tournament, but you would still win those 7 out of 9 times against a meta deck. But you can't top a tournament, so it doesn't matter. You're not going to be meta. And so that's why I'd say meta decks are not necessarily good. Now, another thing, just to completely solidify my point, is I want to just mention something about this deck right here, Shoujo Doji. This deck was almost completely irrelevant in the Set 13 meta. Set 13 meta was when Worlds happened. And now if you look at this list of decks that have topped in the Set 13 meta, which this may be, I'm not 100% sure this is including everything, because as you can see, there's not really that many tops in total. But Shoujo Doji has one top. Let me tell you what that top is for those of you who don't know. That one top from way back when was the Bushiroad Championship Series World Finals. So basically, this deck won Worlds, even though it wasn't meta at all. And the reason why that can happen is because, rogue decks are a thing. Your opponent not knowing what your deck does is actually part of what makes your deck good or bad. And so meta decks, your opponent does know what it does, which makes your deck worse. Whereas you can bring this deck to Worlds and win the whole tournament, even though it's not meta, because it's a really good deck and people don't know what it does. Meaning, I must imagine that in casual play, this deck was great. That's all I can really say about that. But, things started to change. People started playing it a little bit more, so it's topped a little bit more. But, not an insane amount more. But, it did win Worlds. Which I think is basically the best thing you can say about a deck. I think I've explained how tournaments are different from casual play. You have to win a certain amount of rounds, and that makes you not want to play a high roll deck, and you also just straight up wouldn't top with a high roll deck necessarily. This can be different in team formats, but still, and there are also decks in the meta that maybe are not expecting to get countered, because another thing I will say about tournaments is if a deck's only purpose is to counter your deck, your opponent isn't going to bring it or you won't necessarily play against it, because if you win your first round and it's like a mirror match, chances are, most of the decks that were just meant to counter your deck got eliminated by other decks in the first round. Whereas in casual play, somebody can legitimately just say, whenever I'm playing against you, I'll just play a deck that counters your deck, which means your deck might not necessarily be that good. So once again, that's just about how decks can be countered. And then rogue decks, the element of surprise, quite a helpful thing. So that's my points, and I know there's not a ton of evidence to my claim, but I'd just say, be careful if you are playing whatever game you're playing in, and you think, hey, I should just get a meta deck to beat all my friends.